December the 17th, 1944. The 1st SS Panzer Division was rolling west through the Ardennes, its spearhead commanded by SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper. His orders were simple: seize the bridges, cross the Meuse, and drive for Antwerp. But the entire German timetable depended on one thing: speed. Just a few miles ahead lay the town of Trois Ponts, a junction where the Salm and Amblève rivers met. 3 highway bridges carried the road west. If Peiper could capture them intact, his tanks could reach the Meuse by nightfall. If he could not, his campaign was finished before it began. The race was on. So how did a few hundred engineers, armed with nothing but explosives and a single anti-tank gun, stop the most feared Panzer division in the German army? The answer begins in the cold, dark hours before dawn on December the 17th, 1944. That evening, 2 squads of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion left a sawmill at Grand Halleux. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel David E. Pergrin, had ordered them to prepare the bridges at Trois Ponts for demolition. The engineers worked through the night, wiring the spans of the Amblève and the Salm with explosives, knowing the Germans were coming. Colonel Harry Anderson commanded the 1111th Engineer Combat Group. He had taken charge of the defense of Trois Ponts, deploying his men at the key approaches. His orders were blunt: hold the bridges as long as possible, then blow them. When someone asked if he intended to withdraw, Anderson replied, "We have come several thousand miles to fight these Nazis, not to withdraw from them." While the engineers placed their charges, a single 57mm anti-tank gun from the 526th Armoured Infantry Battalion was positioned on the road to Stavelot, about a mile north of the railroad underpasses. A half squad of engineers with bazookas dug in alongside the gunners. They laid a daisy chain of mines across the asphalt and waited. 2 privates from the 526th, Ralph Beaker and Francis Fraser, were sent 250 yards up the road with more mines. They hid in a spot where the river and the road met, ready to pull a string of mines across the pavement if German tanks appeared. Beaker later wrote that the half-track that brought them there vanished when they needed it most. At about 11 in the morning on December the 18th, the lead Panther of Kampfgruppe Peiper nosed around the bend. Beaker and Fraser yanked their mines across the road and ran for the river, believing they were dead men. The Panther stopped abruptly. The German commander, a man named Erich Strelo, climbed out and cleared the mines, but the delay was enough. The 57mm gun opened fire. Its early rounds set the lead Panther smoking. The crew bailed out and hit the ground running. But the German column was 19 tanks strong. The second Panther fired 4 rounds at the American position. 1 shell skipped off the river, another hit a tree behind the gun, showering the crew with fragments. The gun crew kept firing. They had only 7 rounds. Captain Jewett, the officer commanding them, tossed shells across the road to Lieutenant Green, who passed them to Private Salazar, who handed them up to the gunners. They hit the lead tank again, but a 75mm shell struck the base of the gun, killing the entire 4-man crew and stunning Private Salazar. The stand of the 57mm gun had bought the engineers what they needed most: time. While the German column was checked at the roadblock, the warning reached the bridge guards. At the first sign of German armor closing in, the engineers twisted their detonators. The Amblève bridge blew with a roar that echoed off the cliffs. Seconds later, the Salm bridge was demolished as well. The charges had been set by Sergeant Jean Miller of the 291st Engineers. The bridges collapsed into the rivers, and 2 massive pillars of smoke and dust rose over Trois Ponts. Peiper's quick route west was gone. Joachim Peiper, watching from his command vehicle, later said, "If we had captured the bridge at Trois Ponts intact and had had enough fuel, it would have been a simple matter to drive through to the Meuse River early that day." But the bridges were gone, and his fuel was running low. He had no choice. He turned his column north, into the narrow Amblève Valley, toward the village of Gleize. In the afternoon, the weather briefly cleared. American P-47 Thunderbolts from the 9th Tactical Air Command spotted Peiper's column strung out on an exposed mountain road near Cherneux. There was no cover. The fighter bombers attacked for 2 hours, hitting the panzers again and again. The German flak panzers fought back, firing their 4-barreled guns from open turrets. 1 Thunderbolt was set ablaze and crashed, but the dive bombers kept coming. When the attack was over, 3 Panthers and 5 half-tracks lay burning on the road. The delay cost Peiper 3 more hours he could not afford. The men of the 10th Flak Company had fought desperately. 1 gunner, SS Private Karl Wortmann, remembered the long rocky wall along the road and the hopeless defensive combat against 16 aircraft. The flak crews kept firing, refusing to abandon their guns, but the damage was done. Peiper's timetable was slipping away. At dusk, Peiper's vanguard reached the Lienne River near the village of Habiermont. A timber trestle bridge crossed the river, the last bridge on the road to Werbermont. If the Germans could take it intact, they could still break west, but the engineers of the 291st had already wired it with 2,500 pounds of TNT. Lieutenant Al Edelstein commanded the demolition team at the bridge. Sergeant Edwin Pigg and his squad had planted the explosives and connected the detonator. When Corporal Chapin spotted the first German tank emerging from the gloom, a 72-ton King Tiger, he called out to Edelstein. The lieutenant waved his arms frantically. Corporal Chapin grabbed the detonator key. It was a small metal device, cool to the touch, connected by wire to the charges. He twisted the key. The explosion ripped through the Lienne Bridge, sending timbers and planks high into the air. The King Tiger slammed to a halt at the river's edge. Blocked. Peiper's lead element had reached the Chauveheid Road junction at 8 that evening, only to watch the bridge blow in front of them. The column had nowhere to go. Peiper ordered reconnaissance to find another crossing, but the search came too late. A reinforced company of the 2nd Panzer Grenadier Regiment crossed a small footbridge further north, only to run into a roadblock set by Captain Edward C. Arne's F Company of the 119th Infantry Regiment. Arne had moved his company forward in the dark, leading his men along the Grand Mont rivulet toward the Lienne. He placed a squad of scouts ahead of the column and set up a roadblock at Neuf Moulins. He had no idea where the enemy was, but he knew that if the Germans broke through here, the road to Liege lay open. At about 2200 hours, German half-tracks approached Arne's position. The lead vehicle mounted a 75mm assault gun and fired 2 rounds into a house occupied by Lieutenant Austin's platoon. The half-tracks rolled right past the American positions. They were heading up the main road, looking for an open path. They found a tank destroyer waiting for them. The tank destroyer put 3 rounds into the lead half-track. The vehicle burst into flames, blocking the road. The remaining half-tracks tried to turn around, but bazooka fire from the rooftop stopped them. Bazooka Man, Private First Class Mason Armstrong, knocked out 2 half-tracks from a second-story window. The enemy survivors withdrew to the east. Late that night, a jeep pulled up to Arne's command post. A tall, lean paratroop officer with 2 stars on his helmet stepped out. "I am Jim Gavin of the 82nd Airborne Division," he said. Captain Arne, stunned, reported that his men had secured Neuf Moulins. Gavin nodded. "My people will be relieving you here," he said. "We're on the ground now." The 82nd had arrived, and the ring around Peiper was closing. While Peiper's column was still grinding to a halt in the narrow Amblève Valley, the American 30th Infantry Division was already moving to seal his fate. On the morning of December the 18th, the 1st Battalion of the 117th Infantry Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Frankland, detrucked 2 miles north of Stavelot. They found the men of the 526th Armoured Infantry Battalion, who had been fighting a desperate holding action, still holding the line near a burning gasoline dump. Frankland's orders were direct: attack south into Stavelot, clear the town, and cut the German supply line. The battalion advanced with a company on the right and B Company on the left of the highway. Ahead of them, the gasoline cans were still burning, sending columns of black smoke into the cold sky. German King Tiger tanks loomed in the streets, their 88mm guns sweeping the approaches. But Frankland's men were veterans of the Siegfried Line fighting. They did not hesitate. Riflemen infiltrated into the center of Stavelot, taking the town square by late afternoon. They held it with rifle grenades and bazookas, keeping the German tanks at bay. By 15-20 hours, the 1st Battalion had cleared the northern half of Stavelot. The Germans still held the bridge across the Amblève and a fringe of houses on the south bank. But the vital road junction was back in American hands. Frankland could see German tanks and vehicles moving on the south side of the river. He knew the bridge had to be destroyed to cut off Peiper completely. The 118th Field Artillery Battalion arrived that evening, its 105mm howitzers registering on the bridge approaches. That night, the Germans tried to probe the American lines. A King Tiger rolled into the square, only to be driven back by bazooka fire and anti-tank grenades. The tank backed into a building which collapsed on it, forcing the crew to abandon it. A second tank was knocked out a block away. The narrow streets prevented the German armor from deploying effectively. By midnight, the 1st Battalion held Stavelot north of the river. Peiper's supply line was cut. The German command knew they had to reopen the road through Stavelot or lose the entire spearhead. On the morning of December the 19th, 2 separate battle groups moved to recapture the town. From the southeast came Kampfgruppe Sandig, from the west, Fast Group Nittel. Both columns converged on the Amblève bridge, which was still intact in German hands. If they could break through, they could resupply Peiper and resume the drive west. Franklin saw them coming from his observation post on the high ground north of town. He called for artillery fire, and the 118th Field Artillery Battalion responded with massed concentrations. The German infantry was pinned down in the open. But the armor kept coming. A column of King Tigers from the 501st Heavy Tank Battalion rolled toward the bridge, using the houses on the south bank for cover. They were trying to reach the turn where the road crossed the bridge, where their heavy frontal armor would protect them. Sergeant Clyde Gentry commanded one of the M10 tank destroyers positioned on the high ground north of the river. His gunner, Corporal Buell Sheridan, had a perfect field of fire at the bridge approach. When the first King Tiger nosed out from behind a house, Sheridan caught it in his sights at 125 yards. His second round knocked the turret clean off. A second King Tiger tried its luck and was hit before it reached the halfway mark on the bridge. Two more Tigers advanced. Gentry's gun stopped both. The German counterattack stalled under the combined weight of artillery and direct fire. Nittle's group attacking from the west was also broken up. American fighter bombers struck the German columns, adding to the chaos. By nightfall on the 19th, the Germans had failed to recapture Stavelot. The bridge was still intact, but it was under constant American observation and fire. Franklin knew it was only a matter of time before the Germans tried again. The bridge had to be destroyed. Lieutenant Leland Cover of the 105th Engineer Battalion received his orders around noon on December the 19th. He was to destroy the Stavelot Bridge. Cover drove as close to the river as he dared, then crawled forward on foot to the front line, where the 117th Infantry was holed up in houses and basements. The bridge was in no man's land. A German King Tiger sat on the south bank, covering the span. In daylight, any approach would be suicide. Cover sketched the bridge from an upper-story window. He estimated the span length and deck thickness. He decided on 1,000 pounds of TNT, 20 50-pound boxes, enough to guarantee the bridge would fall. The plan was to approach after dark, under cover of artillery fire. The 117th Regiment would fire high explosive and smoke shells onto the German positions to mask the noise and the movement. Cover assembled his demolition team. At dusk, Cover led his men forward. Each man carried a 50-pound box of TNT. The streets were littered with broken glass from shattered windows, crunching under their boots. The artillery fire covered the sound. They reached the bridge and stacked the TNT directly on the deck, over the thinnest point of the first span. Cover set 3 fuses with detonators and fuse lighters, each burning for about 1 minute. He wanted no chance of failure. Cover signaled. All 3 fuse lighters were pulled simultaneously. The team ran. Seconds later, the explosion ripped through the night. The first span of the bridge collapsed into the river. Stone houses near the bridge ends crumbled. Windows for blocks around were blown out. Cover and Sergeant Richardson crawled back to the riverbank and looked over the edge. The gap was clean. No German tank could cross that. Peiper's encirclement was complete. While the fight for Stavelot raged, another German force was assembling east of Malmedy. Colonel Otto Skorzeny, the commando leader who had tried to infiltrate American lines with English-speaking troops in captured vehicles, had been ordered to pull his 150th Panzer Brigade together. His 3 combat groups, X, Y, and Z, had been scattered by the poor roads and American resistance. Now they were concentrating near the village of Engelsdorf, south of Malmedy. Skorzeny's mission was to capture Malmedy and open a supply route to Peiper. He had 10 tanks left, a mix of Panthers, Mark IVs, and captured Sherman tanks disguised as American vehicles. He had no artillery. American reconnaissance patrols had reported that Malmedy was weakly held. Skorzeny planned a surprise attack from 2 sides on the morning of December the 21st, hoping to break through before the Americans could reinforce. But Malmedy was no longer weakly held. Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin of the 291st Engineer Battalion had organized roadblocks and minefields around the town. The 99th Infantry Battalion had arrived, along with tank destroyers from the 825th Tank Destroyer Battalion. The 120th Infantry Regiment had moved into position along the railroad embankment. Skorzeny's reconnaissance was outdated. The Americans were waiting. By the evening of December the 20th, the situation was clear. Peiper was cut off in La Gleize, his fuel running low, his ammunition nearly gone. The Stavelot Bridge was gone. The 82nd Airborne Division was closing in from the south. Skorzeny's attack on Malmedy had not yet begun, but the Americans were ready for it. The iron ring was tightening. The question was not whether Peiper could break out, but how many of his men would survive the attempt? This trap had been set 2 days earlier. On the foggy morning of December the 19th, Peiper made his first attempt to break the ring, striking at Stoumont. He knew the American 30th Infantry Division was closing in from the west, and the only way to break free was to seize the town and force open the road to Liege. At around 0900 hours, 7 Panthers and a battalion of Panzer Grenadiers rolled forward into the haze. The American defenders in Stoumont were the 3rd Battalion of the 119th Infantry Regiment, backed by 8 towed tank destroyers from the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion. They had dug in along the eastern edge of town, covering the road from Gleize with a hasty minefield and a single 90mm anti-aircraft gun. When the German tanks emerged from the fog, the gunners opened fire at once. The 90mm gun knocked out a Panther before the Germans could locate it, but return fire from the 88s destroyed the anti-aircraft piece moments later. For 2 hours, the fighting swung back and forth, with American infantry firing bazookas from windows while German tanks tried to blast them out. Then Lieutenant Walter Macht arrived with 10 M4 Sherman tanks from the 743rd Tank Battalion. Macht's tankers rolled straight into the fight, engaging the Panthers at close range. In 10 minutes, they destroyed 3 German tanks and broke up the assault. The surviving Panthers pulled back, and the Stoumont road remained blocked. Peiper's first attempt to break the ring had failed. December the 20th brought clear skies and a new threat to Peiper's rear. Task Force Lovelady of the 3rd Armoured Division had been ordered south from Spa to establish a roadblock at Trois Ponts. Lieutenant Colonel Lovelady led his column, 2 tank companies and an armoured infantry company through the winding forest roads toward the vital bridge over the Amblève. At the same moment, a German supply column was driving north from Trois Ponts toward La Gleize, carrying fuel and ammunition that Peiper desperately needed. The 2 forces met at a sharp bend in the road near the village of Cou. American tanks opened fire at close range, destroying the lead trucks and blocking the narrow road with burning wreckage. The surviving German vehicles scattered, but the damage was done. Lovelady's tanks took up positions overlooking the Trois Ponts crossing and began laying mines. Within hours, the roadblock was complete. Any German attempt to reach Peiper from the south would have to fight through a wall of steel and explosives. That same morning, the 82nd Airborne Division was closing the ring from the south. Its 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment under Colonel Reuben Tucker received orders to seize the village of Cheneux, the last German-held bridge over the Amblève south of La Gleize. The paratroopers knew the Germans were waiting for them. They attacked anyway. The 504th's 1st Battalion jumped off at 1400 hours from Rahier, advancing in column along the road to Cheneux. Company B, under Captain Thomas Helgeson, took the lead. 500 yards east of Rahier, they ran into a German outpost. A brief firefight cleared the road, but the enemy pulled back in good order, luring the paratroopers forward. When the battalion reached the open ground before Cheneux, the Germans were waiting. The 84th Flak Assault Battalion had dug in 14 flak wagons, half-tracks mounted with quadruple 20mm cannons, covering every approach. As the paratroopers emerged from the woods, the Germans opened fire with everything they had. The effect was devastating. Company B was pinned down in the open, unable to move forward or back. The 20mm shells chewed through the frozen ground, cutting down men by the dozen. Captain Helgeson tried to call for artillery support, but his radio was knocked out. Company C, attacking on the left, suffered the same fate. Within an hour, both companies had lost half their strength. Colonel Tucker knew he could not leave his men exposed on that killing ground. At nightfall, he ordered a night attack. The 2 shattered companies reformed into 4 assault waves, and at 1930 hours, after a 10-minute artillery barrage, they went forward again, this time under the cover of darkness. The fight for Cheneux would be decided in the hours after midnight. While the paratroopers bled on the southern bank of the Amblève, Peiper launched a counterattack on the western edge of Stoumont. His objective was a large building the Americans were using as a command post, a sanitarium for sick children and elderly patients. If he could retake it, he could break the siege from the inside. At 2300 hours, between 50 and 100 Panzer Grenadiers, supported by Panther tanks, stormed the sanitarium. The Americans holding it, platoons from B and C companies of the 119th Infantry, fought back with grenades and rifle fire. But the German Panther tanks fired 88mm rounds straight through the ground floor, driving the defenders from room to room. The Americans were forced to withdraw from the main building, falling back to a hedge line 30 yards away. 11 men, led by Sergeant William Widener, held out in an adjoining annex, refusing to retreat. 3 Sherman tanks tried to counter the German armor, but the slope was too steep and muddy. 2 were knocked out in quick succession. At midnight, the sanitarium was back in German hands, but the road to Stoumont remained blocked. Peiper had won a building, not a breakthrough. The ring was tightening, and he knew it. December the 21st dawned cold and overcast, and the 504th Parachute Infantry resumed its assault on Cheneux. Tucker committed his 3rd Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel Julian Cook, to make a wide flanking march through the woods to the north. Cook's men marched 6 hours through rough, frozen terrain, looping around the German flak positions, and emerged on the northern edge of the village by late afternoon. The Germans, still focused on the frontal assault, were caught by surprise. Cook's paratroopers charged into the village, clearing houses one by one with grenades and bayonets. The flak wagons, deadly in the open, were useless in the narrow streets. German crews fought desperately, few surrendered. By nightfall, Cheneux was in American hands. The 504th had lost 225 dead and wounded, most of them from B and C companies. Company B had 18 men left, Company C had 38. The battalion had destroyed 14 flak wagons, a battery of 105mm howitzers and dozens of vehicles. The bridge over the Amblève at Cheneux was no longer available to Peiper. While the 82nd Airborne was sealing the southern escape route, Major Hal D. McCown, commander of the 2nd Battalion of the 119th Infantry, was conducting a reconnaissance east of Stoumont. His mission was to find a route to cut the road between Stoumont and La Gleize. He led a small patrol deep into the woods, moving cautiously through the fog. At about 1600 hours, McCown and his radioman walked into a German ambush. A machine gun fired over their heads, and enemy infantry closed in from 3 sides. There was no chance to fight or run. McCown raised his hands and became a prisoner of war. He was taken to the German command post in Stoumont. As McCown was led through the streets of Stoumont, he saw German engineers preparing demolitions. Trucks were being stripped of usable parts, and wounded men were being loaded onto any vehicle that could still move. Peiper's command post was under direct American artillery fire. The SS lieutenant colonel was running out of time. That night, Peiper received the news he had been dreading. The relief attack by Hansen's battle group had failed. The Amblève bridge at Petit Spa had collapsed under the weight of a single assault gun, and American artillery had shattered the remaining crossing attempts. There would be no rescue from the south. No fuel, no ammunition, no way out. Peiper gathered his officers in the basement of a farmhouse opposite the church in La Gleize. The situation was stark. Surrounded, out of fuel, low on ammunition, and with 800 men still alive, he radioed division headquarters and requested permission to break out on foot. The answer did not come that night, but Peiper was already planning for Christmas. While the ring was closing on Peiper in La Gleize, a different kind of battle was brewing 12 miles to the east. German reconnaissance units began probing the outskirts of Malmedy, a small Belgian town that sat astride a vital road network. Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin, commanding the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, had been organizing the town's defenses for days. He knew that if the Germans broke through here, they could open a supply route to Peiper from the east. Pergrin had help. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Hansen arrived with the 99th Infantry Battalion, a unit of Norwegian Americans, nearly 900 strong. Together, the 2 officers surveyed the ground and chose their main defensive line, a raised railroad embankment that curved along the southern edge of town. It was the best natural obstacle in the area. Pergrin's engineers had already laid minefields and set up 15 roadblocks covering every approach. The defenders dug in along the embankment as darkness fell. B Company of the 99th Battalion took the central section, with tank destroyers from the 825th Tank Destroyer Battalion positioned to cover the underpass. The men were cold, tired, and short on supplies, but they had artillery support from the 118th Field Artillery Battalion, and they had orders to hold their ground at all costs. They did not know it yet, but they would be tested at dawn, December the 21st, 1944, 3:30 in the morning. Colonel Otto Skorzeny launched his attack on Malmedy from 2 directions. Kampfgruppe Y advanced from the southeast along Highway N23, while Kampfgruppe Z struck from the south toward the Warch River Bridge. Skorzeny had 10 tanks, a mix of Panthers and captured Shermans, supported by several hundred paratroopers and SS grenadiers. The Germans believed Malmedy was held by only a thin screen of engineers. They were wrong. The lead German half-track hit a mine on the N23 and erupted in flames. Machine guns and tank destroyers opened fire from the railroad embankment, tearing into the German column. The attack from the south fared no better. German infantry crossed the Warch River and tried to approach the paper mill, but trip flares, strung by Pergrin's engineers, lit up the night. American artillery hammered the valley. The Germans were pinned down in the open. Private First Class Francis Curry, an automatic rifleman with the 120th Infantry Regiment, was at the center of the fight. German tanks had overrun a nearby tank destroyer position and were closing on his platoon. Curry grabbed a bazooka, crossed the street under heavy fire, and knocked out a German tank with one shot. He then stood in full view of the enemy and launched anti-tank grenades at another vehicle. Under his covering fire, 5 pinned-down Americans escaped to safety. His Medal of Honor was earned in those desperate minutes. December the 22nd and 23rd brought no relief for Skorzeny. The 150th Panzer Brigade had lost more than 200 men killed and scores wounded in the failed assault. American artillery pounded the German assembly areas without mercy. Skorzeny's tanks, outgunned and outpositioned, could not break the railroad embankment line. Every attempt to advance was met by concentrated fire from infantry and tank destroyers firing from flanking positions. By December the 23rd, Skorzeny had seen enough. He ordered his surviving forces to withdraw to defensive positions south of Malmedy. The attack was over. The Americans had held the town with a patchwork force of engineers, infantry and tank destroyers, fighting without tank support against a determined enemy. The railroad embankment, that simple raised line of earth and stone, had proved to be an unbreakable wall. The failure at Malmedy meant that Peiper would receive no relief from the east. The 150th Panzer Brigade, Germany's desperate attempt to open a supply route using captured equipment and English-speaking commandos, had been shattered. Peiper remained alone in Gleize, surrounded, out of fuel, and running out of time. The iron ring around his battle group was now complete. The only question that remained was how he would choose to die. December the 22nd dawned cold and still over Stoumont. Brigadier General Harrison reached the front lines west of the sanitarium that morning, expecting another day of hard fighting. But something felt different. No fire came from the building. 2 Belgian civilians reported the Germans had pulled out during the night. Harrison ordered a reconnaissance patrol forward. They found the sanitarium empty, its walls scarred by days of shelling. Inside, 2 or 3 badly wounded Americans told the story. The Germans had evacuated the building at 0400 hours. The 1st Battalion moved in without firing a single shot. Beyond the sanitarium, Stoumont itself showed signs of recent occupation. Burned vehicles, abandoned equipment, and the marks of tank tracks told of a hasty departure. But the rearguard fought only briefly. By mid-morning, American troops controlled the town. Peiper had given it up. The capture of Stoumont meant more than just ground gained. It signaled that the German spearhead was no longer advancing. Peiper was pulling his forces back, concentrating them for something else. What that something else would be, nobody on the American side yet knew. That same day, a second drama was unfolding miles to the south. Hansen's battle group, the main hope for Peiper's relief, attacked out of the Wanne assembly area at 0800 hours. Their objective was to cross the Amblève River and fight through to Gleize. The 1st and 3rd Battalions led the way. The 1st Battalion crossed the river near Petit Spy, using a temporary bridge the engineers had repaired overnight. But the span was fragile. When the first assault gun tried to cross, the bridge collapsed, plunging the vehicle into the water. The crew escaped, but the crossing was lost. The 3rd Battalion made better initial progress, reaching Petit Coup along the Trois Ponts road. There they ran straight into Task Force Lovelady's roadblock, supported by tanks and artillery from the 82nd Airborne Division. Without heavy weapons of their own, the German infantry could not advance by nightfall. Both battalions had stalled. Hansen ordered them to dig in where they stood. A radio message crackled through to Gleize that evening. The last hope of relief was gone. Peiper received the news in the basement of his command post and knew what he had to do. On the afternoon of December the 23rd, Peiper gathered his commanders in the farmhouse opposite the church. The situation was beyond desperate. Fuel was gone. Ammunition was down to a few rounds per gun. Food had run out days ago. The Americans were tightening the ring. Peiper turned to the captured American Major McCown, who had been brought to the command post. He dictated a letter proposing an exchange. The German wounded would be left behind in American care. In return, the American prisoners would be freed. McCown could not promise anything, but he understood the gesture. At 1400 hours, the division radioed its answer. Permission to break out was granted. Peiper issued the order. All vehicles and heavy equipment would be destroyed. Every man would carry only what he could walk with. The password for the night was set, Merry Christmas. Throughout the evening, the men of Kampfgruppe Peiper prepared. They stuffed demolition charges into engine compartments and gun breeches. They wrapped their boots in cloth to muffle the sound. They checked their weapons, pocketed their last clips of ammunition, and waited for the signal. 800 men stood ready. At 0200 on Christmas Eve, the column slipped out of Gleize. They moved south through the ruins toward the railroad viaduct, then down to the old wooden footbridge over the Amblève. The bridge was narrow and slick with frost, but the crossing was quiet. The Americans did not spot them. Beyond the river, the ground rose steeply into the Bois de Stallon. The column entered the forest and began the long climb. The snow was knee-deep. Men stumbled, got up, and kept moving. Wortmann, the gunner from the 10th Company, remembered the march as a test of sheer endurance. Peiper walked the length of the column, speaking to the men, keeping them together. At dawn they reached the town of Broom, but reconnaissance reported it occupied. Peiper turned the column northeast, skirting the village and climbing toward the hills of Grandcou. They marched through the Bois Tourbillot, then up to Henri Moulin, which was empty. There Peiper allowed a long rest. The men collapsed in the snow. As darkness fell on Christmas Eve, the column moved again. They crossed the Trois Ponts to Bassé-Baudot Road. A group of Greife commandos had scouted ahead. When the lead elements reached the crossing, American tanks and infantry opened fire. In a brief, savage fight with hand grenades and Panzerfausts, the Germans broke through. McCown, who had been following in the rear of the column, saw his chance and slipped away into the dark. The column pushed on through the night, climbing into the Bois des Échevins. They could hear American artillery firing from positions ahead. The front could not be far now, but between them and safety lay the Salm River, and every bridge was guarded. Word spread down the column. Any man who could swim would cross the river. The rest would have to follow. Wortmann watched as a human chain formed, men linking arms and stepping onto stones in the ice-cold water. The current was strong, the stones slick. Some fell, but others pulled them up. Waist-deep in freezing water, 30 meters wide, they crossed on the far bank. The column reformed. They climbed the hill toward Grand Halleux, then turned east through the forest. By mid-afternoon on Christmas Day, the first men reached the town of Wanne. German sentries, stunned and relieved, guided them to the division command post. Peiper and his commanders reported to Schloss Wanne. Of the 800 men who broke out of Gleize, 770 reached German lines. The rest had been killed, wounded, or captured during the march. Every vehicle, every tank, every piece of heavy equipment was lost. But the core of Kampfgruppe Peiper had survived. McCown, who escaped during the second roadblock fight, made his way back to American positions the same day, carrying the story of what he had seen. Every one of those men survived the battle. Pergrin and Anderson were decorated for leadership. Arn and his men rejoined the drive east. Curry received the Medal of Honor for his actions. Gentry's tank destroyer crew was instrumental in breaking the German assault. Cover was commended for the demolition of the Stavelot Bridge, and Beeker survived his icy plunge into the Amblève to tell the story of the lone anti-tank gun. If you have family stories from the Battle of the Bulge, or if an uncle or grandfather ever told you about that winter in the Ardennes, I hope you will share those memories in the comments. We read every one, and if you want to keep following the histories we tell here, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a like. It means the world to us, and it helps keep these stories alive. Thank you for listening, and Merry Christmas.